I still remember the heavy, sweet air of Charleston summers, how the magnolia trees bloomed on our street, their thick leaves casting shadows over the wraparound porch of our family home. We lived in a grand Victorian house on Magnolia Avenue, with creaking wooden floors and stained glass windows that painted the morning light in bright colors across the hallway. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen, a fairy tale house. White columns, blue shutters, rose bush climbing the front fence. But inside, the walls hummed with the tension of my father's ambition. My father, Richard Carter, was as much a force of nature as the Atlantic storms that sometimes battered our coast. He had built Carter Confections from nothing, at least. That's what he'd tell anyone who would listen, especially when reporters came to interview him for local business magazines. He was never one for humility. At the dinner table, he'd recount the story of how he started his first bakery with $50 and a borrowed oven, and how now he commanded a $70 million empire that supplied breads, cakes, and pastries across America and parts of Europe. He demanded excellence and discipline from everyone around him, but especially from his children. Mistakes, in his mind, were weaknesses, and weaknesses were unforgivable. My mother, Lavra, was the soft heart of our home, though her warmth sometimes seemed swallowed up by my father's shadow. She had once been a music teacher before marrying into the Carter legacy. By the time I was old enough to notice, her grand piano in the sitting room was mostly silent, its cover gathering dust. She tried to protect my brother and me from our father's sharper edges, but in a house ruled by business, her gentleness often faded into the background. Then there was Daniel, my older brother. Daniel was everything my father wanted, a born leader, sharp with numbers, at ease in a suit from the time he was 16. He was already involved in company decisions by the time he graduated high school. He and my father spoke their language, one of margins, markets, and deals. If there was ever a golden child in our family, it was Daniel. And then there was me, Emily Carter. I was the dreamer, the quiet one who'd rather spend Saturday afternoons in the kitchen than at a board meeting. While my father and brother debated the merits of wheat suppliers from Illinois versus Kansas, I'd be in the kitchen with my mother, learning how to shape dough into delicate braids or how to make caramel that didn't burn. For as long as I can remember, the kitchen was my sanctuary. I loved everything about baking, the slow rise of bread, the way butter and sugar creamed together, and the comforting predictability of flour on my hands. Baking was magic to me, a way to create joy from simple ingredients. Still, I grew up in the shadow of the Carter name and the expectations that came with it. My father insisted that real success meant expanding, taking risks, and building something the world couldn't ignore. Sometimes, late at night, I'd lie in bed and imagine a different kind of success, one where the measure wasn't dollars, but the happiness of people who tasted my cakes. I kept those dreams mostly to myself, knowing how little patience my father had for sentiment. Everything changed on my 21st birthday. The house was full of laughter that night, champagne glasses clinking, and a fire roaring in the hearth despite the humidity outside. My father was in rare good spirits, joking with his business partners in the parlor. It took every bit of my courage to pull him aside and tell him what I wanted, not a trust fund, not a management role in his company, but a chance to build something of my own. I told him I wanted to open a bakery, a little place downtown, where I could bake the way I wanted, not the way the market dictated.
He stared at me for a long time, a slow smirk growing on his face. "You think you can handle the real world, Emily?"
He said, loud enough that a few guests glanced over. "All right. Here's $250,000. Call it an early lesson. Just don't expect to come crying back to me when it fails." It wasn't exactly a blessing, but it was enough. I left the party that night with a check and a racing heart. My mother squeezed my hand as I passed her in the hallway. "You can do this, sweetheart," she whispered. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her support meant more to me than all my father's money. Within weeks, I was deep in the messy, exhilarating work of opening Emily's Bakehouse. It was a tiny shop on a busy Charleston corner, with exposed brick walls and windows that fogged up every morning from the ovens. I poured myself into it, waking at 3 a.m. to bake, scrubbing pans by hand, and designing menus that mixed Southern tradition with European technique. In my first year, I barely broke even. Some days I thought my father might have been right. But then something shifted, word began to spread. Customers raved about my honey pecan sticky buns and lemon lavender tarts. A local magazine named us Best New Bakery. Tourists stopped by on their way to the beach. Slowly, our tiny corner shop became a Charleston staple. The more we grew, the harder I worked. I learned to negotiate leases, train staff, and handle suppliers who tried to take advantage of me because I was young and worse, a woman. Every setback, an oven fire, a staff walkout, a hurricane that flooded the shop taught me something new. There were nights I slept on a cot in the back room, too exhausted to drive home. But every morning, the smell of baking bread made it all worthwhile. By the time I turned 30, Emily's Bakehouse had expanded to 2 more locations in Charleston and 1 in Savannah, Georgia. When I opened my first bakery in New York City, my father sent me a terse email. Good luck. No praise but no insults either. I took it as progress. Over the years, my bakery became my family. We hired people who needed second chances, taught them skills, and watched them grow. We baked birthday cakes for children in foster care, donated bread to food banks, and hosted holiday dinners for the lonely. We won awards, appeared on food networks, and even published a cookbook that became a bestseller. By 40, I had shops in Chicago and London, England. My net worth climbed to $770 million. Not that I ever let it change me. And yet, no matter how many people I employed, or how many headlines my bakery made, my father never once told me he was proud. At family gatherings, he'd still ask about my little shop, as if I were still rolling dough in the back of some forgotten kitchen. But I knew, deep down, that my greatest achievement wasn't just building a business. It was carving a space in the world that was truly mine, even if I had to do it without his approval. The winter I turned 42 came in colder and sharper than any I could remember. Charleston rarely saw snow, but that year, ice clung to the city's winding roads like a warning. I should have known better than to drive myself home that night, exhausted after a 14-hour shift preparing for the holiday rush. But I was stubborn, always convinced that nothing could stop me when I was working. The bakery had just finished its biggest catering order ever, a gala in Atlanta, worth nearly $300,000. I'd been running on adrenaline, barely sleeping, making sure every last croissant and cake went out flawlessly. The accident happened in a blink. One moment, I was humming along to the radio, thinking about what flavor to experiment with next. And the next, my car was spinning across black ice, the world blurred into a chaos of metal and glass. There was a thunderous crash, a jolt, and then silence. When I woke up, the sterile white ceiling of the hospital loomed overhead, and my whole body ached in a way that told me something was deeply wrong. My left leg was heavy and stiff, suspended in a brace. My hands were bruised, my head throbbing. But even worse than the physical pain was the confusion. I blinked away the fog and searched for familiar faces. Only my mother was there, sitting quietly beside my bed, her eyes swollen from crying. She held my hand so gently as if she thought I might break. The look on her face, part relief, part sorrow, told me more than words ever could. I croaked, "Where's Dad?" She hesitated, looking down at the blanket. He was here, for a while. Her voice trembled, and she squeezed my hand a little tighter. But he said he had to go back. There were things at the company, important things, he said. Before I could process the hurt blooming in my chest, a nurse arrived with a small envelope. "This was left for you," she said, her voice clipped but kind. I recognized the handwriting immediately, my father's tight, no-nonsense script. I opened it, my hands shaking. The note was short, businesslike. "Emily, I can't risk my empire for your mistakes. Daniel will take your place at the company. You'll have to recover on your own." I stared at the words, willing them to change, but they remained stubbornly cold. I felt my throat close, my heart pounding as if it wanted to escape my chest. In all my life, I had never felt so small, so abandoned. I knew my father valued the company above all else, but I had always hoped that, when it truly mattered, I would still be his daughter first. It was clear now, to him I was just another asset that could be replaced. The days in the hospital crawled by, marked by the beep of machines and the endless stream of doctors. My mother never left my side, reading to me, brushing my hair, and helping me with everything I couldn't do for myself. She tried to keep my spirits up, but every night I saw her sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness with worry etched deep into her face. My brother Daniel never visited, not even once. Instead, I saw his name in business articles and news segments about Carter Confections, smiling for cameras and shaking hands with new investors. As my body healed, so did my resolve. Each day I pushed myself to move, to get stronger, driven by a mixture of anger and determination. The bakery staff sent cards and flowers, and even some customers dropped off baked goods, ironic but sweet. It reminded me that, outside my father's orbit, I had built something real and lasting, something that mattered to people. 2 weeks after the accident, still limping but finally strong enough, I signed my discharge papers and called a cab to take me straight to the Carter Confections headquarters. The drive through downtown Charleston was bittersweet. Every street held memories. Every corner a reminder of how far I'd come. I arrived in front of the glass and steel building my father had built to house his dreams. The place where I'd spent so many late nights as a young woman, trying to prove myself. I braced myself on my crutch and walked inside. The receptionist stared, her eyes wide with surprise, but she didn't try to stop me. I marched down the familiar hallways, each step echoing with defiance until I reached the boardroom. The heavy oak doors were closed, but I pushed them open anyway, not bothering to knock. The room was full, my father at the head of the table, Daniel by his side. A circle of board members and executives all pretending not to notice the family drama unfolding in front of them. The moment my father saw me, his jaw tightened. "Emily," he said, not bothering to stand. "You shouldn't be here." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I came to get answers."
He didn't waste any time. There's nothing to discuss.
"Your brother is taking over all your responsibilities. We can't have uncertainty in the company, not with everything you've just put us through. You're no longer needed here. In fact, you're no longer welcome at the company or at home." His words hung in the air, heavy as stones. For a moment, no one spoke. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of support, any familiar face willing to meet my eyes. But everyone avoided my gaze, people I'd worked with for years, people I had trusted. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was a moment of clarity. I realized that I didn't need his approval or their validation. I had built my own empire, one that couldn't be taken away with a few cruel words. I stood up straighter and let a small smile curl on my lips. "Thank you, Dad," I said softly. "You may regret this sooner than you think." He scoffed, waving me away like a bothersome child. But at that moment, I remembered something he didn't. All the contracts that had put Carter Confections on the map, those million-dollar deals with European distributors. The celebrity wedding cakes, the international hotel partnerships, had been negotiated and signed by me, in my own name. They belonged to me, not to him. I left the building with nothing but my dignity and my mother's soft whisper in my ear as she hugged me at the door. "You're stronger than you think, Emily." I carried those words with me, out into the cold Charleston air, knowing that this betrayal was not the end of my story, only the beginning of a new chapter. The week that followed my father's betrayal felt like living inside a hurricane, chaotic, relentless, yet strangely exhilarating. When I stepped out of Carter Confections' glass and steel fortress for the last time, I was filled with grief so heavy I thought it might break me, but something deeper kept me afloat, a stubborn ember of pride and memory. For years I had been told I was small, that I was secondary. Now I was determined to prove to myself, if no one else, that I was much more than that. I spent the first few days at my mother's small apartment, my injured leg propped up on stacks of old cookbooks. The kitchen there was tiny, nothing like the sprawling professional bakeries I'd built, but it was mine for now. As I sipped tea by the window, watching the winter drizzle wash over Charleston, I began making phone calls. My contact list was long, built over 2 decades of tireless work. Hotel managers in Chicago, distributors in Paris, restaurateurs in London, and celebrity clients from Los Angeles to New York. One by one, I explained the truth. The contracts they'd signed with Carter Confections were, in fact, signed with me, Emily Carter, not the company. To my immense relief, every partner and every supplier confirmed what I already knew. The contracts were mine, legally binding to my name. My phone became my lifeline. Each call was another piece of my old world shifting into the new. The legal team I'd quietly hired years ago assured me that Carter Confections could not fulfill those contracts without my express consent. The realization hit me like a jolt. My father had cut me out, but he'd cut out the very lifeblood of his empire at the same time. I barely slept, running on pure adrenaline. If I was going to turn this around, I needed to act quickly. I registered a new company, Emily Carter Enterprises, and leased a set of industrial kitchens in Atlanta, a city I knew well from my bakery expansion days. My old staff, loyal to the core, flocked to my side, some even quitting their jobs at Carter Confections to join me. We worked side by side, rolling dough, decorating cakes, and boxing up pastries for shipment across America and Europe. I took calls between batches, answered emails with flour on my hands, and made decisions as fast as possible. It was a logistical nightmare and an emotional roller coaster. The volume was staggering, French hotels demanding wedding cakes, Chicago steakhouses desperate for our signature rye bread, and London restaurants requesting hundreds of tarts for holiday parties. My name was suddenly everywhere on delivery slips, order forms, and soon enough in the press. While I scrambled to fulfill orders, chaos erupted at Carter Confections. Rumors swirled around Charleston and spread like wildfire through the business world. Without the contracts, the company's entire revenue stream ground to a halt. Shipments were delayed and orders were canceled. Suppliers pulled out, terrified of breach of contract lawsuits. For the first time in decades, Carter Confections missed delivery deadlines. Customers were left in the lurch, some angry, others confused. Then the media caught wind of the story. Headlines screamed from every business section, not just in America but across the Atlantic too. Daughter outsmarts father, takes over $500 million in contracts overnight. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, calls from journalists, TV stations, radio hosts, all wanting a comment, an interview, a soundbite. At first, I hesitated, wary of stirring the pot further, but my closest friends convinced me to take control of the narrative. The first interview was filmed in my rented Atlanta kitchen. I wore my usual simple jeans, a flour-dusted apron, hair tied up, and no makeup. The reporter asked me what it felt like to dismantle my father's empire in a week. I told her the truth. This isn't about revenge. It's about hard work, about honoring the promises I made to my clients, and about standing up for yourself, even when everyone expects you to sit quietly in the corner. My words struck a chord. That video went viral, replayed on TV screens from New York to London, and suddenly I was being celebrated not just as a businesswoman, but as a symbol of resilience. With every passing day, Carter Confections spiraled deeper into disaster. Their stock price plummeted. Major investors jumped ship, terrified by the legal limbo and financial chaos. Board members started resigning. I heard from former colleagues that my father stalked the halls like a ghost, balking at lawyers trying to salvage contracts he no longer owned. Even Daniel, my brother, stopped showing up to meetings. It was as if the very soul of the company had vanished overnight. Meanwhile, I was working harder than I ever had in my life, but I had never felt so alive. There was a giddy freedom in it, a sense that, for the first time, the world was watching me not as Richard Carter's daughter, but as Emily Carter, the woman who had built, lost, and rebuilt everything with her own hands. Within a week, the financial numbers became almost surreal. Emily Carter Enterprises signed over $500 million in contracts. My net worth soared past $1 billion. It was dizzying, humbling, and a little terrifying all at once. My father tried to call me. At first, the messages were sharp and demanding. "You need to call me back, Emily. This is your responsibility. You can't just walk away." Then they became pleading. "Emily, please, we need to talk. This has gone too far." Finally, they turned desperate, his voice breaking, the words growing smaller with every voicemail. But I never picked up. I knew that, if I let him, he'd try to take this victory from me too. For the first time in my life, I let the silence stand between us. In that silence, I found a peace I had never known. At the end of that week, I stood outside my new Atlanta kitchen, watching trucks pull away loaded with cakes and pastries destined for cities I'd only ever dreamed of. The sky was cold and blue, the air crisp with winter. I felt lighter, freer than I'd felt in years. My mother called that night, her voice bright for the first time in ages. Emily, I saw you on the news. I'm so proud of you. Your grandmother would be too. As I lay in bed that night, exhaustion tugging at every muscle, I realized that this was more than a business victory. It was the reclamation of my life, my worth, and my future. I had lost so much, but in the ashes of what my father had tried to destroy, I had found something no one could ever take away again. Myself. There are moments when the world seems to open up before you, shining with possibility, and you know you have crossed a threshold you can never return from. That was what life felt like for me after the whirlwind week that changed everything. The dust settled, and for the first time in my adult life, I could truly call my future my own. I moved to New York City just as spring unfurled itself in Central Park. The penthouse I chose was nothing like the ornate Victorian house on Magnolia Avenue where I grew up. It was sleek, open, and filled with light floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's endless energy, the pulse of America beating just beyond the glass. I bought it not to impress anyone, but because the space felt honest, a place without secrets, where nothing could be hidden in the shadows. My mother moved in with me, and together we made the empty rooms come alive with laughter, music, and the sense of home-baked bread and fresh coffee in the morning. With the chaos of the Carter Confections collapse behind me, I finally had the freedom to shape my business according to my values. I handpicked a new team, people from all backgrounds, united not by resumes but by their hearts. I hired staff who'd been overlooked elsewhere, women starting over after hardship, young men who'd never finished college but had a talent for pastry, and immigrants with secret family recipes. I paid them well, offered real benefits, and watched as the bakery's new headquarters in Manhattan became a place where people wanted to come to work not out of obligation, but out of pride. It wasn't just business that filled my days. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to breathe. I took walks in the park, visited museums, and traveled to Europe to meet with clients face to face. I started baking again not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was a quiet pleasure in returning to the kitchen late at night, hands dusted with flour, my mother humming a melody in the background as I shaped loaves or whipped up a batch of scones just for us. I started writing again, recording my journey for the world, honest, raw accounts of how I lost everything I thought I needed, and how I found so much more. Of course, I couldn't escape reminders of the past. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a news headline, Carter family estate sold at auction, and remember the old house in Charleston, with its peeling paint and hidden sorrows. My father's face would flash through my mind, not as the towering figure of my childhood, but as the broken man he became in the aftermath of his own decisions. When I heard that he had moved to a small, rented apartment in Savannah, picking up odd jobs to make ends meet, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity, maybe even a quiet kind of sadness. I never responded to his calls or messages, though they came less and less often over time. Daniel, my brother, disappeared entirely, rumored to have started over in some small city in Europe. I couldn't bring myself to feel bitter toward him. He had always wanted my father's approval more than he'd ever wanted success for himself, and I sometimes wondered if, in losing the company, he'd lost himself as well. There were nights when the memories kept me awake. I would sit by the window, New York's neon lights flickering below, and ask myself whether I should forgive the men who had hurt me and let them back into my life. But then I would remember all the times I was made to feel small, invisible. I would think about the women and men I now worked with, all of us building something honest together. And I knew deep down that some chapters must stay closed if you are ever to write new ones. Life was no fairy tale, but there was magic in the ordinary, and I began to see it everywhere. The joy of a child biting into her first slice of chocolate cake. The tears of an immigrant baker who, after years of struggle, could finally send money home to her family. The laughter that echoed in my new home, a sound I had so rarely heard growing up. Every bakery we opened in a new city felt like planting a seed for the kind of world I wanted, one where kindness and courage mattered more than the bottom line. With my mother at my side, I found a rhythm. We traveled to see friends, cooked elaborate Sunday breakfasts, and sometimes late at night we'd revisit old photo albums. She would laugh, her eyes brighter than I remembered from my childhood, and tell stories I had never heard about her dreams, the places she'd longed to see, the music she once played. I realized I had inherited not just my father's stubbornness, but my mother's quiet strength, her capacity to endure and hope. The success of Emily Carter Enterprises quickly eclipsed even the wildest ambitions of Carter Confections. Within 2 years, we opened flagship stores in Chicago, Los Angeles, London, and Paris. Fortune and Forbes ran features about my second act, hailing it as a story of comeback and resilience. But the greatest compliments came not from magazines or investors, but from the people who walked through our bakery doors and left with smiles, or from the letters I received from women who said my story inspired them to finally take their risks. Looking back, it would be easy to see my journey as one of revenge, a daughter besting her father, a family feud playing out on the stage of American business. But that's not what I remember when I close my eyes at night. What I remember is the journey from doubt to self-belief, from fear to freedom. I remember the faces of friends and strangers who held out their hands when I needed them most. I remember learning, at last, that my worth had nothing to do with what anyone else thought of me. If I have learned anything, it is this: never let anyone tell you what you are worth or what you can achieve. The world will try to shrink you, but you must rise, over and over, until you become the person you were always meant to be. My story is not about a bakery, money, or even my family's fall from grace. It is about reclaiming my life and my voice and daring to create something beautiful from the ruins. And now, every evening as the sun sets behind the Manhattan skyline and the city lights come alive, I look out at the world and smile. I know that, whatever comes next, I am finally and fiercely myself.